Hi everyone, welcome to Draw with Jan channel. In this video, I'm going to show you how to draw and color an orange using color pencils. I have used Carandache luminance color pencils for this. We are mostly going to use 3 shades of pencils, yellow, orange and red. So please feel free to use any good quality color pencils that you have. If you notice the texture of an orange peel, it is thick and waxy in nature, so I'm sure it's going to be a good learning experience on how to produce a realistic drawing of an orange using shading techniques. Let's get started. Using yellow ochre first to mark the outline, I'm leaving some of the areas blank for the highlights. Marking the area for the stem using grass green. Now using orange for the area around the stem. The area around the stem is usually darker. This is just the first layer of shading and I'm using orange for this. Shading this area dark will help you highlight the stem that sits on top of it. If you look at the surface texture of an orange peel, it is thick, pitted and waxy. You can achieve this effect using your shading techniques. You need to highlight some parts of the skin to make it look bulging outward. To do this, you will have to shade the area around it darker. This is just the first layer of shading and I'm using orange for this. I will be adding at least 2 or 3 more layers later on using darker shades. If you observe the reference picture carefully, it looks like blocks of skin but not in any specific pattern. So what I'm doing is leaving the middle part blank, that is white, and shading the area around it. And as I'm doing this, I am creating different patterns, sometimes a square or sometimes a circle and sometimes smaller squares and sometimes smaller circles. This is largely the technique that I've followed throughout this drawing. I'm also making sure that the edges are smooth and it does not look like an outline around the highlighted area. Also, do not apply too much pressure while shading. This is just the first layer and we're going to be adding multiple layers on top of this. I'm now using black for the stem outline. Using dark green for the inner outline of the stem. The area around the stem is usually dark, so I'm using red here for the shading. Now the first layer of shading for the stem and the top part is done, and I'm now moving on to shading the rest of it using orange color. I will be marking the outline in orange and following the same techniques that I just showed you for creating the pattern on the layer of the skin. Now the pattern here is slightly different. Instead of drawing circles or squares, I'm drawing lines. And if you notice, the lines are zigzag and not straight. I'm going to draw a few lines on top of this in the same pattern. Now back to drawing the block-like patterns. For the area on the top near the stem, I'm trying to do larger blocks. Make sure the lines are not harsh. You can avoid this by using blending techniques, using the same pencil, by applying varied amounts of pressure. Once you draw an outline for a block, shade the inner side using lighter amount of pressure to make it look smoother. What follows from now on is mostly a time-lapse video of my drawing, applying the same techniques that I explained in detail. Wherever I have applied a different technique, I have slowed down the pace of my video and explained it in detail. There are some parts of the orange where the patterns are not very clearly visible. Shading those parts is going to be quite easy. These are mostly around the edges and the bottom part of the orange. The middle part of the orange is going to be slightly darker, and you will notice that as we shade the middle part. As mentioned before, the middle part of the orange has to appear darker in shade. I'm following a slightly different technique here for the shading. Instead of drawing blocks of patterns with the middle part being highlighted, I am drawing blocks with orange in the middle and highlighting the area around it. These are in random shapes and sizes. Try to follow the reference picture to the extent you can. However, you do not have to worry about reproducing what's exactly in the reference picture. You just need to make sure you get the overall technique right. If you're looking to produce a realistic drawing, you need to spend a considerable amount of time observing the reference picture very carefully to understand the different techniques being applied, to understand the highlights, the dark values, and the midtones, and get them right. Before I started drawing and coloring this orange, I spent at least 15 minutes studying the picture. And I took about 5-10 minutes planning out the different shades of colors that I needed. And I took about 3 to 4 hours to complete this drawing. As you can see, once you get a hang of the technique, it's quite simple and easy to draw it. However, it does need a lot of patience. It takes a lot of time to get the level of detail that you need to produce a realistic image. It also needs a lot of practice, so don't be frustrated if you don't get it right the first time. Just keep practicing and eventually you will be able to do it. I'm now moving on to the next layer of shading using red. Now this is going to be easy because you've already created the patterns using orange. You're just repeating the same thing using red. You will notice that when you're using red now, the highlights become more visible. There are a couple of reasons I don't use red or the darker shade directly in my first layer, and instead I use yellow first and then orange and then red. The reasons for doing these multiple layers of shading are: 1, it helps improve the richness of your color, and number 2, it helps you easily achieve a smooth effect. Blending is much more easier when you use 2 or 3 different colors. However, it is important that you do not apply too much pressure while shading, because using multiple layers and applying too much pressure can spoil the tooth of your paper. Wherever needed, use orange in between to blend the shades. As mentioned before, the technique here is slightly different. These are just zigzag lines, and I am just using orange once again to darken some of these lines. I'm making the lines thicker in some of the areas and also trying to create random patterns. Now look at the reference picture for the mid-tones, the darker shades in the orange, and try to follow those patterns. The middle portion of the orange is slightly darker than the rest of the orange, so I'm shading that part again with another layer of orange color. Also, if you notice, the outlines in the reference picture are darker, so I'm defining the outline more clearly. There are also some parts of the skin darker than the rest, so going over those areas with another layer of orange color. For the darkest areas, I'm using red for the shading. In the middle of the orange, if you notice, there are 2 or 3 vertical lines visible. Again, don't make harsh lines, try to make it as smooth as possible. Now this part of the orange is the darkest, so using red here for the shading. I am just following the pattern that we already created. Shading it dark here will make your object look round. Getting the dark values and the highlights in the right place will help you produce the 3D effect in your drawing. I'm using orange now to get rid of those harsh lines and blend in the colors. I have now slowed down the pace of this video because I'm using a different technique here. I'm using brown to create small dots on the surface of the skin. If you observe the reference picture carefully, there are some places where the dots are more clearly visible. Also, sometimes there are small lines instead of dots. Also, focus on the shading around the area of the dots. Moving to a time-lapse video where I'm just going to follow the same technique that I showed you. Now switching back to red for the next layer of shading to define the dark values more clearly. There are some parts of the orange where the dark lines are more clearly visible, and I'm focusing on creating those values. Now moving on to the final shading for the stem. I'm using dark green for the dark values and using black for the darkest values. You need to make the stem appear on the top, so the area below it has to be really dark, as though creating a shadow effect. Now some finishing touches for the area around the stem. Now finally, the shadow for the orange. Shadow is very important for a realistic drawing. For the shadow, I'm using light grey and dark grey and also black for the portion near the orange. Hope you enjoyed watching this video. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel for more drawing videos. Thank you and see you again soon.